Species. Unite.
I mean, organoids in general are very exciting replacements for animal research because you could model a kidney or a liver or a heart without taking them from a real animal, which is very important to support that kind of thing. But yes, when it's the brain, there's this fear that you might end up creating another sentient being, and then you've just replaced one sentient being with another, and maybe not made things better at all. So it seems really, really important to guard against that risk.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. This conversation is with Jonathan Birch. Jonathan is a philosopher and a professor of philosophy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is also a writer, and his most recent book is The Edge of Sentience: Risk and Precaution in Humans, Other Animals, and AI. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. We're here to talk about your latest book, The Edge of Sentience. Before we get into it, will you just talk about sentience itself and how you define it?
I think, like a lot of people, I came to the topic of animal sentience through pain and asking questions like, does an octopus feel pain? What about a crab? What about an insect? How are we supposed to tell? But I came to the view that pain is rather too narrow a concept here because we don't want to exclusively focus on pain. Certainly other kinds of negative experience like frustration, boredom, these also matter and should concern us. And the positive side of mental life, like joy and excitement and pleasure and comfort, these things matter too. And so the value of the term sentience for me is that it's this way of capturing all of that. It's about capturing any subjective experience that an animal has that has a positive or a negative quality.
I know it's different than consciousness, obviously, but I think people confuse the two when they're talking about sentience. They're kind of combining consciousness too.
It's a bit of a minefield, isn't it? It's fine for these terms to be contested, I think, because that's just how it is when you have such an important concept. As I see it, I think when people talk about consciousness, well, they're thinking about our own case. And in our own case, I think you have multiple layers, all of which go into what we're talking about when we talk about consciousness. So there's our immediate raw experiences of the present moment and of our own bodies, including feelings like pain and pleasure and our sensory experiences as well. And this is sentience. This is the base layer, the most elemental, most evolutionarily ancient aspect of our consciousness. And then in our own case, we have overlays on the top of that. We have sapience, so we have the ability to reflect on our experiences. And we have selfhood, because we can abstract from our reflections this idea of a persisting self with a past and a future. And I can have thoughts about my future 20 years from now or 20 years in the past. And consciousness has become this catch-all term for all of that stuff. And when we're thinking about other animals, well, we can ask questions about any of these layers. But for me, perhaps the most important question to ask is about the base layer, about the sentience. How widely shared is that? And there's certainly no reason to think it's uniquely human. And in fact, I think it's very widely shared by many, many other animals.
Well, and you talk about, and this really surprised me, because you talk about humans. And before I read your book, I thought, oh, human sentience, that hasn't been an issue for a long, long time. Like, we've recognized sentience in humans forever. And then I read your book, and you tell a couple of stories, starting with Kate Bainbridge. That's so recent.
Oh, there's plenty of ongoing controversies concerning human sentience. Absolutely. And yeah, one of the issues I talk about in the book is disorders of consciousness and the so-called vegetative state, which is a term I oppose. And part of the reason is that, well, it's this label applied to patients who, following brain injury, have sleep-wake cycles. So they have periods of apparent wakefulness, but they don't communicate in any way during those periods. They're unresponsive outwardly. And for a long time, doctors regarded these patients as being incapable of any experience, as lacking sentience. And from around the 90s and 2000s, it started to become quite clear that for some of these patients, this just wasn't true, that they were outwardly unresponsive because of the seriousness of the brain injury, but they were still feeling things. They were still experiencing what was happening to them. And where that was not taken into account, and where the patient subsequently recovered and was able to then communicate and describe what had happened to them, they described that as being an awful experience. What a horrendous experience to be being treated by a clinical team that assumes you feel nothing and never explains what is happening to you. So these cases are, of course, a cautionary tale, and they teach a lesson about the importance of erring on the side of caution that I think we should then carry over to many other cases at the edge of sentience as well.
The other one I wanted just to mention, because it stunned me, was the infants, and the fact that we were operating on infants until the 80s without anesthesia.
This is also horrendous and extraordinary. Yeah. That there was a widely perceived view that newborn infants, the brains were too immature to feel pain, combined with a common view about anesthesia being very risky for newborn babies, that led to, right into the 1980s, just the really stunning thing, common clinical practice of doing surgery without any anesthesia at all. And it changed because of two things, really. Part of it was brave researchers actually looking at the effects of this, studying the consequences for the babies, and finding that this surgery was leading to massive stress responses that did lasting developmental damage to babies that had it. And at the same time as that research, also public outcry when, equally brave patients, parents of these babies went public with their concerns about what had been happening, arguing that that was no longer defensible. Yes, of course, there are always risks associated with anesthetics, but we're now seeing the risks on the other side are absolutely enormous, and that clinical practice had to change. And in fact, when you had those two things at once, clinical practice did change quite rapidly.
It's unbelievable. And like you say, we should err on the side of caution. But historically, we haven't erred on the side of caution.
Yes,
when it comes to
exactly.
sentience.
Yeah, because people say we should err on the side of caution a lot. They say we should apply the precautionary principle. This gets said a lot, and there's sometimes a response that, oh, everyone thinks that. That's what we do already. And in fact, there's this litany of examples from many different contexts that show that's not what we do already. We'd actually need to change quite a lot across many different areas to truly develop a precautionary attitude to cases where we have some reason to think there might be sentience, but we're not sure.
A couple years ago, the UK did its Sentience Act, and you were a part of writing that and putting that together. Will you talk about that and kind of who was given consideration and who was, deemed sentient, and what this all means?
Yeah, it's a story that started with the UK leaving the European Union and leaving the Lisbon Treaty that has a line in it about respecting animals as sentient beings. And the government declined to import that line directly into UK law, leading to some bad press about why you're not doing this. Do you not think animals can feel anything? And so the government at that time announced that it would bring in new legislation to enshrine respect for animal sentience in UK law, and it would go beyond what was there before, because it would put all policymakers under a duty to consider the animal welfare impacts of their decisions which is a great idea. Of course, when you commit to that, when you're creating this duty, you have to say what the scope of the duty is. You have to say which animals. Do you mean all animals, including microscopic ones? Do you just mean mammals or pets or what? So the government produced a draft of the bill that extended to all vertebrates, which was in some ways progressive because fishes were in there, which is good. But it also led to justified criticism, particularly from people saying, what about octopuses, crabs, lobsters? And so it was in that context the government then commissioned a report by a team led by me to advise them on this and on the question of whether the bill should be amended to include octopuses, crabs, lobsters, shrimps. And we reviewed all of the evidence we could find. We developed a framework for synthesizing it in what we thought was a sensible way. And we thought that in light of the evidence that now exists, it's very reasonable to extend that protection to these animals. So that's what we recommended. And the bill was amended. And so this new Sentience Act, as it's called, in the UK does, for the first time, provide a degree of protection to crabs, lobsters, shrimps.
And when you say a degree of protection, how does it protect them?
Well, to a large extent, the details are still being worked out, because what it does is it puts policymakers under this duty to consider the animal welfare impacts of their actions. And so, in areas of government where arguably welfare of crabs and lobsters has been ignored, like, in enforcement of slaughter regulations and things like that, there's now a duty to no longer ignore those animals. And you can combine that with regulations that say no slaughter should cause unnecessary suffering to the animal. And so, some people have been arguing that those two laws together, they already should make it illegal to do something like dropping a lobster into a pan of boiling water. And that issue has not been resolved. There's not been a test case that has shown that. And so we have a legal grey area. Now, in our report, we recommended that the government avoid that. So avoid any grey areas by just unambiguously changing all the other laws so that they're consistent with the new one. And we thought that was a pretty sensible recommendation, but they didn't do that, or they haven't done that yet. And so UK animal welfare law as it stands has ambiguities in it that are yet to be resolved.
Well, talk about that, like with octopuses, and who decides and how you decide if they're candidates for sentience, or kind of where they sit on the spectrum of where we think they are.
A lot of the evidence concerns pain. So despite what I was saying earlier about the need to remember that sentience is not just pain, and that we should be thinking about joy and excitement in crabs and lobsters as well, in reality, the scientific evidence that currently exists has overwhelmingly focused on markers of pain. And so that's what we were primarily reviewing. And they're mostly behavioral. You do get some markers that are to do with the nervous system and the brain. I mean, people sometimes think of crabs and lobsters as not having a brain, which is just wrong. They do, and they have complex integrative centers in the brain that could plausibly support a kind of sentience. So that matters. And it matters that they have what scientists call nociceptors, which are specialized nerve cells for detecting noxious stimuli, like extreme heat. And it matters that those things are joined up, that the nociceptors connect to the brain. So you do have some evidence of a neurological character. But also, remember, we are looking at animals that are very, very distant from us in evolutionary terms. And so the brain just is very differently organized. And so what we won't find is the exact same mechanisms that are related to pain in our own brains. So their behavior becomes incredibly important. And so most of the evidence we were looking at was about behavior. And that's a good challenge as well, because not every behavior is evidence of sentience. If you think of touching your hand to a hot stove and your hand recoils, this is just a reflex. The brain is not involved at all, and it's well underway before you experience any pain. And so the experience of pain is not causing our reflexes, it's doing something else. And what it's very likely to be doing is related to learning and decision making. And so it's really not by looking at reflexes in these animals, but by looking for decision making and learning that goes beyond a reflex and shows that, just as when you touch that hot stove, your hand recoils, then you feel the pain. And because you felt the pain, you learn to avoid doing that again. You can look at whether the animal will learn from experience in the way that we do when we feel pain.
What about where you can't see actual evidence of sentience yet? You call it an investigation priority. Like it's erring on the side of caution.
The book is based around these two concepts, I suppose, of sentience candidate and investigation priority, where a lot of it is about how to live with uncertainty. And we can't be sure on the basis of the evidence that we have that crabs, lobsters, octopuses, fishes are sentient, because the evidence doesn't allow for certainty. It's always possible to imagine that you might be wrong. And so we can't really talk of certainty or proof in this area. But what we can say is that the evidence shows them to be sentience candidates, in that a realistic possibility of their sentience has been established to the point where it becomes irresponsible to ignore that possibility when making decisions that affect these animals. Because you can do things, you can take precautions, you can do things to reduce the risk of causing suffering. And if you pay no regard to that at all, you're being reckless or negligent. And so we have responsibilities to take sentience seriously in these sentience candidates. And then in other cases, we just have less evidence. And here I use the term investigation priority, thinking about snails, spiders, for example. There's no strong reasons to think they're not sentient, in my opinion. There's no strong evidence against. But people have really not looked in the way they have at these other animals. And so the kinds of evidence we have for these other animals are not there. And so it's then very, very hard to design precautions. And so in these cases, what we urgently need is more evidence, really, rather than knowing exactly what we should be doing right now.
One of the subjects in the book that you talk about that I didn't even know this was a thing is neural organoids. Will you explain what that is and the possibilities for sentience at some point?
Yes, the book is about the whole family of cases at the edge of sentience where we don't know what to do because we don't know whether there's sentience there or not. And so we've talked about babies and we've talked about people with brain injuries and other animals. And also there's this emerging risk from organoids that didn't even exist 10 years ago because the technology is so new. What researchers do is they induce stem cells to form human brain tissue, leading to three-dimensional miniature models of human brain regions. And it's pretty exciting. It's pretty amazing technology leading to remarkable things. In one case, there was a system that started spontaneously developing precursors to eyes. In another case, there was a system that was mounted on an electrode array so that it could receive inputs and give outputs, and it was linked up to a computer where it was able to play the game Pong. And the researchers showed that across 20 minutes of gameplay on Pong, the performance measurably improved. So the system apparently learned. And intuitively, there must be some point at which we should stop doing this. There must be some ethical limit, where the organoids got big enough or complex enough that it's now inappropriate to be experimenting on it. And no one can agree where that line is. Very big area of uncertainty.
We could be using these instead of animal testing. But then if we're creating sentient organoids, right, what are we really doing?
Yeah, I mean, organoids in general are very exciting replacements for animal research because you could model a kidney or a liver or a heart without taking them from a real animal, which is very important to support that kind of thing. But yes, when it's the brain, there's this fear that you might end up creating another sentient being, and then you've just replaced one sentient being with another, and maybe not made things better at all. So it seems really, really important to guard against that risk.
And then you talk about AI. And I just talked to Jeff Sebo about this with AI like a week or two ago. He was on. And again, I was pretty astonished by possibilities that are coming our way that aren't quite here yet, but that could be in the very near future. Will you just talk a little bit about the importance here of why we need to give consideration?
Well, it is a debate that society is not ready for, I would say. And this worries me quite a bit because I think we need to get ready. I don't think current AI systems are sentient candidates in my sense. So I'm on that team that says insects are and chatbots are not. Even though you can talk for hours to a chatbot and an insect will never say anything to you, because in the end, the evidence from the brain and from behavior I take to be more relevant than language. But at the same time, I don't think we're in a position to rule out the idea of sentient AI because there's no strong support for the idea that conscious experience requires a biological brain. We can't be sure of that. It's a realistic possibility that our brain is able to generate conscious experience because of the computations it performs. And if you could achieve those same computations, but in a different system, you would get conscious experience. And we need to take that possibility seriously. And it means we can't be sure that there will never be sentient AI. In fact, there may be. And what I fear at the moment is that, we have no reliable way of testing for it. And we're going to see big social divisions emerging around it because people are already developing very strong emotional bonds with these chatbots. And in some cases, they think that the chatbot keeps alive the spirit of their deceased relative, and they think the chatbot is their friend or their romantic partner. And we're going to get very large sections of society strongly believing these are sentient beings that deserve protection. And then we're also going to see a large section of society really, really sure that's wrong, and that these are tools that we can use however we want. And the divisions are going to get pretty serious, I think.
It's kind of terrifying. I was thinking this a lot throughout your book, is non-human animals that we kind of agree as society that they're sentient. Dogs, pigs. But pigs, farmed animals, cows, chickens, we treat pretty horrifically. I mean, I guess we would treat them even more horrifically if we didn't think they had sentience. But I don't know how much worse we could really treat some of these farmed animals and animals in general. And I know in the way with the infants, clearly recognizing their sentience stopped the surgeries without anesthesia.
Yeah.
But how does this help with everybody else?
Yeah, it's a good point that recognizing animals of a certain kind as sentient does not immediately lead to change in people's behavior. There's lots of reasons for that, I think. You've got very strong social norms, especially in Western societies, that are telling people it's completely normal to eat very large amounts of meat. And then the industry tells itself that, if we're going to meet that ever-growing demand, we have to compromise on welfare. And that's a very tragic situation. If you want grounds for hope here, consider that in cases where there isn't already a very powerful farming industry with a lobby pushing back against attempts to improve welfare campaigners can achieve a lot. And we see that in the case of octopus farming, I think, where the fact there isn't an established industry there means the evidence just speaks for itself. People can see these are sentient beings that don't deserve to be packed together in conditions where they're just going to injure each other and live horrible lives. People can just see that's inappropriate. There's no big pushback. And so we're seeing bans being passed. There was a ban in California that my team's report helped to shape, and one in Washington state as well. Hopefully we're going to see more of these state level bans. To me, it just shows that the arguments are strong. The arguments speak for themselves. And what you don't get with pigs and chickens, sadly, is political power that allows those arguments to take effect. But in the octopus case, some positive signs.
And I guess it's all works in progress. The more they're recognized, the more policy changes, the more laws change, the more culture changes.
We need more research as well. Research about, there's all this evidence on animal sentience. People's behavior is very hard to change. We can see why it's understandable it's very hard to change behavior. What could we do that might work? What is the way to present information about animal sentience in a way that does alter people's choices? That's certainly one of the things I hope to work on in the future.
When you wrote this, did you get surprised by anything regarding sentience? Did you learn anything that you weren't thinking previously about sentience?
Everything was a surprise. Yeah, some of those historical cases were truly shocking, as I say.
Yeah, it shocked me.
In the animal cases, the amount of evidence that exists now for insects is really striking. And a lot of it from very, very recent, a lot of it concerning bees. But the conversation is not now just one about bees, that we're also seeing absolutely extraordinary things from Drosophila fruit flies. There was a study out just this week about play-like behavior in Drosophila fruit flies, where they will ride a carousel motivated by the experience of that rotating motion rather than by any other reward. So it's very much pushing on the idea that there might be some minimum brain size requirement on sentience. Drosophila fruit flies have 100,000 neurons compared to about 100 billion in the human case. And still we see these extraordinary behaviors. So I never expected this. I wouldn't even say I wanted it, because it makes the moral situation very difficult when you start thinking we've got to try and take steps to help insects. I never thought I'd be in that position, but that's where the evidence is going.
Yeah. But instead, we're now farming trillions, right? And so
a lot of what humans do harms insects on very, very large scales. Yeah, including traditional plant-based agriculture, of course. Pesticides are very heavily used. And now we also have insect farming on top of that. And, not really an industry with established welfare standards. You can say in relation to chickens and so on that having established welfare standards doesn't mean they're high enough, doesn't mean they're good enough. But at least there are some standards in the UK, at least. Whereas in insect farming, it's very much every company doing its own thing. And I think it would be an improvement from there to have some industry-wide standards. So I've been calling for that.
I love it. So pretty much there's nothing left on Earth that we shouldn't be considering a little bit.
I mean, that's not quite right, because evidence is there for insects, which is a huge expansion of our sentient world. It's really dizzying. But the kind of evidence we see for insects is not there for plants or fungi or microorganisms, or even many other invertebrates as well, like plankton and so on. And so I think most life is not sentient. I think sentience is not a biopsychist, as we say in philosophy, and someone who thinks that sentience is a very special property of animals with complex brains. And what we're learning is that insects are in that group. We wrote them off prematurely, and they actually belong in that group.
It's a lot to think about. People should definitely read your book, because the past, present, and future of it all, like where we've been and where we are with sentience, it really makes you consider things that, for me at least, that I'd never thought about before, and how important it is to think about this stuff.
Yeah, and what I want to do is start a discussion. That's why the book is open access. It's free to read online. If you go to edgeofsentience.com, I want the ideas to get out there and to start a conversation. And they in no way end that conversation, because it's a conversation we all need to be having continuously.
Yes, I agree. Well, thank you, Jonathan, very much.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
To learn more about Jonathan and to read The Edge of Sentience, go to our website, speciesunite.com, We will have links to everything. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I'd like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polkey-Link, Bethany Jones, Hannah Gabrielson, Lorraine Doherty, and Anna Kallner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.